These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Black is threatened with the loss of a rook on his back rank. Meanwhile he has an offensive opening of his own at the other end of the board. His knight masks the bishop on c5, since the bishop would attack white's king if unmasked. The key question is what damage the f2 knight might do while black fends off that check. Do you see how this offensive opportunity relates to the threat of rook takes rook e8 that currently worries black? The strength of white's threat depends on the coordination of his rooks on the d-file. That is what prevents black from being the one to gain with rook takes rook. Things would be different if the connection between white's rooks were disturbed, and as it happens, black can cut the rooks off from each other and discover check at the same time with one. Knight moves to d3, check. 2. King moves to h1, rook takes rook, check. Black wins a rook. The knight severs the line of protection to white's d8 rook, and then the knight is protected against capture by the black rook that moves onto d8. The more obvious one. Knight moves to e4, check. Doesn't work. White again replies to. King moves to h1, so now black can play knight takes rook, perhaps thinking he has won the exchange after white recaptures, but white doesn't recapture right away. He instead executes that ongoing threat of rook takes rook, check. The priority of check means that he holds the initiative while black replies bishop moves to f8, forced, and now white still has the recapture bishop takes knight waiting for him at the near end of the board. White to move. What is the best move? This is the conclusion of a famous trap in the Petrov defense. After the opening 1. Pawn from e2 moves to e4, pawn from e7 moves to e5, 2. Knight moves to f3, knight moves to f6, 3. Knight takes at e5, black should not reply with the symmetrical knight takes at e4. If he does, white plays queen moves to e2 as happened here. Look at the black knight on f6, imagine it instead on e4, as it was a moment ago. The move seemed to attack black's knight on e4, but more importantly it put white's queen onto the same file as white's knight and black's king. The makings of a discovered attack thus were in place, with black's own knight on e4 the only impediment. Black blundered away the game by then moving his knight to safety with knight moves to f6, rather than guarding it with pawn from d7 moves to d5, producing the result shown here. for this leaves the kernel of a discovery in front of black's king. White's knight now can go on the attack with impunity. Black's queen is within reach via knight moves to c6, check. The queen is lost to knight takes queen a move later, whether it stays where it is or moves to block the check on the e-file. Black to move. What is the best move? Discover checks with preliminary exchanges. Where does black have the kernel of a discovery? On the g-file, where his knight masks his rook, friendly pieces next to each other always require a close look. Next black looks for a target for the rook and sees white's rook on g2 with the king right behind it. Knight moves to f5, threatening the queen to make time for rook takes rook a move later, makes no sense, the rook is guarded, and anyway white can end the threat with rook takes rook, check. But when the enemy king is close to your target, the natural thought is to try for a substitution, even if it entails a temporary sacrifice. So black starts with 1. Queen takes rook, check. And, after the recapture king takes queen, now has the makings of a discovered check. He only needs a target that his knight can reach in 2 moves, and of course he finds it in the queen on h6. White to move. What is the best move? The same idea in a different visual setting. White's knight on f4 masks his queen, which is aimed at the black knight on h6. Black's knight is protected and thus is an unsuitable target, but since it's next to black's king a substitution is possible, rook takes knight, check. Inviting the recapture king takes rook. Now white is ready to play knight takes at d5, check. And after the king moves knight takes queen. Notice that too. Knight moves to g6, check. Also would work for white, since the knight would have protection on g6 from the rook on g1. But then white wins one less pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's knight masks his queen. The queen doesn't yet have a good target, but it's aimed at the pawn in front of black's king, so black might have a discovered check if the position were jiggered slightly. Consider what other pieces on both sides factor into the position. Black's rook also attacks the c2 pawn. White's queen is nearby, at d1. An idea comes into view: black's knight could attack the queen with knight moves to f2, and unmask a discovered check at the same time, if the pawn on c2 were removed, and perhaps the rook can perform the removal with rook takes at c2. If white responds with king takes rook, then knight moves to f2 indeed wins the queen, whether the queen stays where it is or interposes on d3. Okay, but what if white instead replies to rook takes at c2 with queen takes rook? Answer this question in standard fashion: examine every check you would be able to give in return. Black's only check here would be queen moves to e1. No moves the white king could make would save it. White would have to interpose his queen, and whether he does it on c1 or d1, black mates, queen takes queen, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? One reason to look habitually for kernels of discoveries is that they can help organize the rest of your tactical thinking. Where are the kernels here? Black's g6 knight masks his rook on g8, and his knight on c6 masks his bishop on b7. Both masked pieces are aimed in the general direction of white's king. The more intriguing kernel is the bishop behind the knight on c6, because that knight can go after white's queen with knight moves to b4. If the bishop were to give check when the knight jumped out of the way, knight takes queen could follow. But all this would first require substituting white's king for his bishop on g2. Can it be done? Work backwards. Black would like to take the bishop with another piece, requiring white to recapture with his king. The only black piece now aimed at the bishop is the rook on g8. Its path is blocked by the black knight on g6 and the white pawn on g3. Can those obstacles be removed at the same time? Yes, if the knight captures something the pawn protects. So black plays 1. Knight takes at h4, inviting white to reply to. Pawn from g3 takes knight. Now the position is easy. 2. Rook takes bishop, check. 3. King takes rook, knight moves to b4, check. Dis ch, and black takes white's queen on the next move and then forks white's rooks to boot. As with many tactical sequences, this one can be foiled early. White simply declines to recapture when black plays knight takes at h4, accepting the loss of the pawn rather than heading down the road toward material catastrophe. So against an alert opponent, the value of seeing the sequence is not that you then are able to play the entire thing, it's that perceiving the threat of it allows you to make smaller gains because you know your opponent can't afford to retaliate. White to move. What is the best move? Last, a sequence that involves clearing a path to create a discovered check. Start by spotting the kernel of a discovery for white on the g-file. Anytime you have a rook with a friendly piece in front of it, take notice. Here the idea is especially appealing because black's king is on the same file. Ask what stands between white and a discovered check. Answer, only the g6 pawn. How do you force a pawn to move? By capturing something it protects. The g6 pawn protects the queen, so white plays queen takes queen. After black replies pawn from g6 takes queen, the path on the g-file is clear for the discovered check. Indeed, the double check knight moves to e6, check. Plus. After black moves his king, the only possible reply to a double check, white has knight takes rook. Black recaptures and white has won the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? Discovered mate threats. Now let's see how it can look when a knight discovery involves a threat of mate. In this case the discovery isn't white's best move, but let's find it anyway. White's knight masks his queen, the kernel of a discovery, even if it's a little hard to notice because the queen appears to have no target on f8. But you always want to be aware of the enemy king and its constraints. It's especially important when you have a piece aimed at the back rank. What happens if white moves the knight and then plays queen moves to f8 a move later? It's mate. So white has a perfect target for the queen after all in the f8 square. He can play knight moves to c6, and after black fends off the threat of queen moves to f8, checkmate. White has knight takes queen. What is white's best move? Queen moves to e5, check. Black has to reply with pawn from f7 moves to f6, which then results in queen takes at f6, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? White has the nut of a discovery on the long diagonal leading to h8. His queen has no piece to attack if the knight moves, but since it's aimed in the general vicinity of the king you consider squarest unmasked queen could attack, not just pieces. Look for any checks the queen would be able to give and you find queen moves to h8 and see that would be mate. Black would no more be free to ignore that threat than he would be to ignore a discovered check. The knight therefore will have an unfettered move to make after it vacates the queen's path to h8, and can use it to go after black's queen. Knight moves to d5, and then after black takes measures to avoid being mated knight takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? Here's a harder one. Find the kernel of the discovery. White's knight masks his queen on the 7th rank. If the knight moves, the queen again has no piece it can target, just a pawn, and a protected one at that. But once more you examine the black king and find that the queen would have a great square to attack. Queen moves to g7 nearly would be mate, only the black knight on e6 would prevent it. Now the important thing when your piece is close in on the king like this is not to think about the two halves of the discovery in isolation. Think instead about how the two parties to it here, the knight and queen, can help each other. If white plays the discovery 1, knight moves to g5, he threatens knight takes queen. More significantly, though, the knight also attacks another square next to black's king, thus creating the new mating threat. Queen moves to h7, checkmate. Against this idea black's knight is no help. He is forced to play 1. Black rook takes at f6, as this erases the immediate mate threat on g7, by removing the protection white's queen would have there, and also gives the king a flight square, f8, if white plays queen takes at h7. At this point it might seem natural for white to complete the sequence by playing 2. Knight takes queen, but that would be a mistake. Black then would have rook takes rook, check. Easy to overlook, leaving white still with a winning advantage but not an immediate win. Your first order of business when you have pieces bearing down on the king is to look for mate. While black's move rook takes at f6 ends the threat of 2. Queen takes at h7, checkmate. The move 2. Queen takes at h7, check. Still takes control of the black king's fate and keeps the initiative, comfortably postponing the capture. Knight takes queen through the priority of check. Black's king is forced over to f8. White again has a chance to play knight takes queen, but once more he waits, preferring instead to bring another piece into the mix with rook takes rook, check. Black's king is forced to e8. Now white plays knight takes queen, having used checks to keep that capture available for 2 moves. Black's knight, his last remaining piece, has no safe place to go, and will be lost next move, leaving white with a queen, rook, and knight, and black with no pieces at all. Mate follows shortly. Black to move. What is the best move? Discovered check leading to mate. Again we consider how an idea seen in prior chapters can apply to the knight. Sometimes the piece that unmasks a discovered check can, instead of hunting for material, add more to the pressure on the king or otherwise take part in the creation of a mating net. The position to the left shows how it's done in simplest form. See the kernel of the discovery for black on the e-file. See that the piece to be unmasked, the queen, is aimed at white's king. Should the knight go after material, for example by jumping to g4 and then taking the white bishop on f6 on the next move? No, black should play the knight to f3, delivering checkmate. From f3 the knight adds a second check, which means the king has to move, and the knight seals off d2, the king's only flight square. Notice that from the outset black is threatened with bishop takes queen. This is another reason why a simple discovered check like knight moves to g4 would fail. White would just take black's queen. The only discovered checks that will work here are double checks, because they require your opponent to move his king. White to move. What is the best move? The cluster of white's bishop and knight on e4 and f3 should jump out at you as the possible basis of a discovery. Generally speaking, any friendly piece lined up with a knight should get you thinking this way. The bishop has no target yet in place, but since it's aimed toward the enemy king's corner, thoughts of a discovered check come to mind. The king would need to be drawn over a square onto the long diagonal. A simple if costly way to do this is by planting the queen on the square where you want the king to go, forcing it to capture there, thus queen moves to b7, check. Causes king takes queen. Experiment with what might come next, knight moves to c5, a double check, forcing the king to move and so keeping all of your pieces safe. What would black do? The a8 and b7 squares are off limits to his king, imagine a line through that diagonal, and so is a6, thanks to your knight. So black would have to play the king to c7 or b8. Now consider white's next checks in either case. The pattern of those two same colored flight squares should suggest an attack by the knight, since it can hit them both at once, i.e., with knight moves to a6, checkmate. Finishing the game since white's rook cuts off the whole d-file. This is another sequence where white's threat not only is decisive offensively but also does important defensive work by holding the initiative. If it were black's turn to play, he, too, would have a forced mate. 1. Queen moves to h2, check. 2. King moves to f1, queen moves to h1, check. 3. Bishop takes queen, rook takes bishop, checkmate. One way to defend against a threat like that is to launch an offensive sequence of your own, giving your opponent no chance to get in his attack. White to move. What is the best move? Our current logic continues. Everything starts by spotting the kernel of the discovery. Here white's knight on h4 masks his rook. When the h-file is open and the enemy king has castled on that side, be alert to the relationships between any pieces you have on that line or able to reach it. A good first question is whether the piece to be unmasked has a promising target and, if not, whether one can be created. In this case there's nothing for the rook to take at the other end of the h-file, but the king is close by. Might it be moved over? A natural way to accomplish this is with a check, and especially by a check from a piece moved onto the h-file that the king will be obliged to capture there. So consider queen moves to h7, which requires black to play king takes queen. It's an expensive sacrifice, but since the enemy king is in play it might be worthwhile. Now knight moves to g6, check. Unmasks check by the rook. What would black do then? King moves to g8. Look for a final check and you come to rook moves to h8, checkmate. With the rook receiving cover from the knight. White to move. What is the best move? The key feature of this position is the kernel of a discovery for white on the e-file leading towards black's king. At the moment the bishop on e7 is in the way, it makes a poor target in itself, because it's guarded and less valuable than the rook that would be able to capture it. But the position would get more interesting, because it would involve discovered check, if the bishop could be captured and replaced by the king, and likewise if the bishop could be drawn away from the e-file. White considers whatever checks he can give and finds that one. Queen moves to f8, check. Has the desired effect, forcing black to play bishop takes queen to protect his king. Now the discovery is arranged, but to what end? It had better be good, since a queen sacrifice was needed to get there. Black's king is in the type of cramped position you should associate with mating possibilities, so think about using both pieces in the discovery to go after it. Knight moves to g7, check. Plus is the answer, inflicting a double check that requires the king to move to d8. Look for the next check. Here its rook moves to e8 mate. Notice that too. Knight moves to c7, check. Plus works as well as 2. Knight moves to g7, check. Plus, again black's king is forced to d8, and again white mates with rook moves to e8. It might seem that if white plays knight takes at c7 black could then escape a move later with king takes knight, but white's bishop protects the knight from h2. The details differ, but at a higher level of generality our current pattern thus repeats: queen sacrifice, check, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has the kernel of a discovery leading toward white's king on pawn from h3 moves to g2. He could use his knight to go hunting for white's queen, but the idea is complicated by the attack underway against his own queen, and in any event, when the king's position is so cramped it makes sense to focus on the possibility of mate. If black's knight moves, white's only option is to move his king to e1 or g1. Imagine the knight out of the way move to h4 and consider how it could go after the king on either of those flight squares. A. If white plays king moves to e1, what checks does black then have? Queen takes bishop, which doesn't work, and knight takes knight, which is mate because the bishop on e2 is pinned. B. If white instead plays king moves to g1, knight takes knight no longer works because bishop takes knight results, the bishop not being subject to a pin. But this time the queen check does work, queen moves to g4, checkmate. Ends the game. This is a good study in the value of carefully examining the checks you can give at every turn. After black's first move the white king has 2 places to go. Either way, black has 2 checks, and either way, one of them is ineffectual while the other is mate. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight on e4 masks the paths of his rook and queen. It's an example of something nice that can happen with a knight in the center. The queen is the more important piece, of course, because it has the king as a target once the knight moves. How to exploit this? If the knight goes to f6, then of course black takes it out and avoids the check with king takes knight. But don't give up. The king's position doesn't look as constrained here as it did in the previous position, but its mobility still is quite limited because white has several pieces bearing down on it. If there is a mating net to be created, every move in it almost certainly will be a check, so imagine going through with one. Knight moves to f6, check. King takes knight, and then examine any checks white would have and their consequences. The most useful of those follow-up checks would be 2. Knight moves to h5, check. As you consider black's reply, you might imagine a dark line leading through the squares on the white queen's diagonal and another line all the way down the e-file, since those squares all are off limits to the king. And g7 is off limits, too, because it's attacked by the knight. In fact, the king's only flight square would be f7. Now look for white's next check, keeping in mind that every square adjacent to black's king is under attack except g8. Queen moves to h7, checkmate. Seals off that square and attacks the king as well, leaving it nowhere to go and ending the game. The position is a good illustration of how a king can be tightly constrained even when it has lots of empty squares nearby if those squares are under attack. It takes some practice to get the hang of seeing this. It's worth a little time. White to move. What is the best move? A horizontal study. White has the kernel of a discovered attack on the 7th rank. His rook is aimed toward black's king. Even if the path of the discovery is blocked for now by the bishop on g7, this configuration is a valuable asset and can guide the thought experiments that follow. Consider white's checks and their consequences. Queen moves to h6, check. Is most interesting, as the queen is protected, it forces either bishop takes queen or king moves to g8. What next? A. If black chooses bishop takes queen, it clears the way for the discovered check we had hoped might materialize. Now knight moves to g5, check. Plus forces the king to h8, notice that white's bishop on b3 also participates. And then rook moves to h7 is mate. B. If black plays 1. King moves to g8 instead of 1. Bishop takes queen, then 2. Queen moves to h8, check. Bishop takes queen, 3. Knight moves to h6, checkmate. Likewise is mate via discovery, this time using the bishop on b3, which the knight also was masking. The queen sacrifice on h8 serves to leave that square blocked, further constraining black's king. The trick to the position is seeing that the knight masks pieces in 2 directions, both aimed in the enemy king's vicinity. This creates multiple chances for game-ending discovered checks once black's king is pushed around a bit. More generally, it's a valuable study in the importance of thinking beyond the 2 obvious pieces in a discovery. White finally uses 4 pieces to wrap this position up. White to move. What is the best move? Building the kernel, diagonal patterns. The usual position in this chapter starts with the kernel of a discovery in place at the outset. Perhaps the target needed to be created or improved, or maybe a good threat needed to be found or made for the unmasking knight, but the idea was in place from the start and easily triggered trains of thought about how it might be made to work. We now consider some cases where the kernel is not in place at the start, where it first must be built with an initial move that creates the familiar masking pattern while also forcing a reply by your opponent. The forced move itself often adds one of the necessary elements for a discovered attack, usually by moving a target into place. Then follows the unmasking move that attacks 2 points in the enemy camp at once, requiring one of them to be forfeited. Visually, your task is to become alert to moves that put one of your pieces, in these cases a knight, into the path of another, and then to go through the familiar process of imagining how the discovery might be perfected. In the position on the left, assume black just made a capture with his knight on b5, now the natural tendency for white would be to play queen takes knight. Don't do it. Always examine your checks to see where, if any place, they lead. Here white has the interesting queen moves to c8, check. You see that this forces black's king to h7, and that white then runs out of good ways to hunt the king down. The crucial thing is not to give up then, and instead to back up and see what patterns would be in place. White would have formed the kernel of a discovery. His knight now masks his queen's path toward black's queen on g4. White can unmask the attack with check, knight moves to f8, check. Perfectly safe, as opposed to knight moves to f6, check. And then he has queen takes queen after black moves the king from h7. The trick to the position, of course, lies in seeing the kernel of a discovery when it isn't on the board in front of you but will be created by a move or series of them that you are contemplating. The prospect of a discovered attack might not occur to you in the original position, it might come to mind only once you experiment with queen moves to c8, check. And observe what it does. When you think of a move that puts one of your pieces in line with another, pause to consider the tactical side effects for you or for your opponent. On the other hand, the idea is more likely to become apparent if you can perceive it visually, so study the appearance of this position. Notice, by the way, an amusing mating possibility if black blunders into it. One queen moves to c8, check. King moves to h7, 2. Knight moves to f8, check. King moves to g8, 3. Queen takes queen, king takes knight, 4. Queen moves to c8, checkmate. A back rank mate made possible by black's silliness in allowing his king to get trapped behind his pawns and rook with no defender. White to move. What is the best move? White has no good discoveries to unveil at the moment. His bishop on g2 is behind his knight, but the bishop lacks a good target. So white experiments with other moves and finds that 2 knight moves to c5 and knight moves to d6 are of special interest. They both move the knight into the path of white's other bishop on a3, creating the kernel of a discovery. Examine such moves carefully to see whether they might also force an enemy piece into place as a target of one of the pieces in the kernel. Knight moves to c5 is unattractive because it doesn't force anything. It's also bad because it lets black uncramp his position by exchanging knights. But knight moves to d6 is another matter, it attacks black's rook. Taking the knight with queen takes knight is out for black because the knight has protection, the rook must be moved instead. But where? It has three possible squares, g8, leading to the smothered mate. Knight moves to f7, checkmate, f8, and e7. The key point about either of the last two possibilities is that they move the rook onto the same diagonal as white's bishop on a3, creating a target for it once it is unmasked. The knight then on d6 just needs a violent move to make as it unmasks the bishop. Giving check on f7 wouldn't work because it enables the rook to both extinguish the threat and take itself out of trouble. The correct move is knight takes bishop c8. If black recaptures, bishop takes rook wins the exchange for white on the next move. If black doesn't recapture and spends his move saving the rook, white has won a piece. As this case shows, moves that create the kernel of a discovery are most interesting when they make a side threat against the enemy at the same time, for then he has to spend a move dealing with the threat rather than dealing with the discovered attack you've just constructed. Black to move. What is the best move? Find the discovery for black. The most promising kernel is on the long diagonal where his knight masks his queen, but it's no good because the rook on d4 is protected. So black plays with other moves, he looks for any checks he might give and finds knight moves to f3, forking white's king and rook. If white defends with pawn from g2 takes knight f3, he opens a line to his king on the g-file, an interesting result. Consider whether the move gives black any new checks and you find queen moves to g6, check. It forces white's king onto h1 and, the key point to see, slides black's queen onto line with its knight and white's queen, creating a new kernel of a discovery. With the king moved to h1, the knight on e4 can give check, and unmask a discovery, with knight moves to g3. After white takes black's knight, as he must, black plays queen takes queen. White doesn't have to defend against the initial knight check with 2. Pawn from g2 takes knight, of course. He can play 2. King moves to h1. Then black wins the exchange and a pawn with 2. Knight takes rook, 3. Pawn from e3 takes knight d4, queen takes at d4. White to move. What is the best move? It's important to be alert to mate threats. One way to find them is by looking at any pieces already attacking squares adjacent to the king. Here white's knight attacks g7, and the square is protected only by black's king. If white were to add an attack on that square by his queen, he would threaten mate, so naturally he looks at queen moves to g4. The move not only creates a mate threat but also moves the queen behind the knight on f5, creating the kernel of a discovery, the two queens with a knight between them. How would black respond to the mate threat? He can play pawn from g7 moves to g6, but even so, knight moves to h6, while not threatening mate, then gives check and unmasks the capture queen takes queen. Again we see that the key is to create the kernel while also creating a side threat that busies your opponent. White to move. What is the best move? No doubt you see the kernel of a discovery. White's knight masks his bishop on the pawn from h1 moves to a8 diagonal. But not much can be done with it. The more fruitful thing to notice is that white has a bishop bearing down on the king on the other long diagonal, and that white can create the kernel of another discovery, and also give check, by moving his knight to f6. That move both masks the bishop with the knight and forces black's king over to h8, putting a target into place for a discovered check. Now the knight will have two unfettered moves, so it heads toward black's queen via his rook, knight takes rook, followed next move, after black avoids the check from white's bishop, by knight takes queen. The only fly in the ointment is that after white plays knight moves to f6, check. At the outset, black can end the threat with knight takes knight. How to remedy this? With a preliminary exchange, one queen takes knight, bishop takes queen, and now play continues as described above with black's defender of f6 eliminated. The queen sacrifice is costly, of course, but it pays off soon enough. White to move. What is the best move? Building the kernel, vertical and horizontal patterns. When pieces are collected on a line, as they are on the B file here, it is natural to wonder how you might take advantage of the arrangement. Or you might simply consider every check white can make and see rook moves to b6, check. Either way, the point to see is that rook moves to b6, check. Creates the kernel of a discovery, with white's knight suddenly all that stands between his rook and black's queen. Usually, and here a move that so creates the kernel of a discovery is really interesting only if it also helps create the other elements of a discovered attack by forcing targets into place. In this case, rook moves to b6 also forces the king to find a new square, and its choices are limited to a8 and c8. Whichever move black makes, the king ends up on the same color square as white's knight and is checked on the next move with knight moves to c7, check. Or knight moves to a7, check. After the king avoids the check, white takes black's queen. Notice the style of thought. Take note of moves that put one of your pieces onto a line with another that can unmask it, Consider whether any of those moves also force a reply from the other side, and especially whether they force a target into place. White to move. What is the best move? White has lots of ways to give check with his queen, so inquire into the consequences of each. The most interesting is queen moves to e6. Why? Because it moves the queen behind white's knight and black's queen on the e-file, it thus puts three pieces on a line in the familiar formation for a discovered attack. Again, moves that so create the kernel of a discovery usually need to force other changes on the board that keep the enemy busy and that may also create the remaining elements of the tactic. Here queen moves to e6, check. Not only creates the kernel of a discovery but also gives check, forcing the king onto either h5 or h7. Either way, with knight moves to f6, check. White's knight will give check and unmask queen takes queen.